conversation. Welcome, John, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Frank. I'm delighted to have this chance to talk about what I think is actually the solution to climate change, how we're going to fix it if we ever do manage to fix it at all. What they're celebrating is an agreement that was signed by virtually every country in the world. I think it was 196 countries. Okay, they were cheering the signing of this agreement. This agreement aims to strengthen the global response to the threat of climate change by holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees C of pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Certainly something to celebrate. But those celebrating countries, most of them, many of them, didn't mean what they said. In support of this agreement, countries did make pledges to the United Nations saying what they were going to do about this target. And those pledges have recently been strengthened in advance of the Glasgow summit in December. But they're still not enough to meet even the 2-degree target, let alone the 1.5-degree target that they agreed to aim at. If all the pledges were fulfilled, there would still be an increase of 2.4 degrees, at least according to Climate Action Tracker. And moreover, very few countries are on course even to meet their own targets which they set themselves, their own pledges. Very, very few have policies that Climate Action Tracker reckons are compatible with 2 degrees of warming, despite the fact that they all agreed to achieve that. Apart from a blip that was caused by COVID, the emissions of greenhouse gas are still increasing. You can see the blip there, but you can see that last year was pretty much up to the 2019 levels. So we still have increasing emissions when we should have very drastically decreasing emissions. The British government is one example of a country that didn't mean what it said. It was already clear before the Paris meeting, because it had been made clear by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that the 2-degree target could only be met by the most stringent action to control emissions. It was not possible to meet 2 degrees in any relaxed way at all. It had to be done drastically. Yet within a few days, a couple of weeks after the Paris Agreement, after making the Paris Agreement, the UK government dramatically took 3 negative steps in its control of climate change. It firstly drastically cut the subsidy it was paying for installing solar panels. It issued licenses for fracking in many parts of England with the aim of opening up a new source of fossil fuel, and it removed the tax advantage that it had previously given to low emission cars. It was obvious that the British government had no intention of doing what it had agreed to do. As its own independent climate change committee recently reminded us, and reminds us pretty constantly, the British government likes to make impressive promises on climate change. And at Glasgow, you may remember that it puffed itself up as a leader in climate action, but it's not interested in keeping its promises. It's simply hypocritical. Australia is another example of egregious inaction. It has more emissions per capita than even the United States, and that's not counting the contribution that Australia makes to climate change by exporting hundreds of millions of tons of coal every year to be burnt in Asia. It has pledged to reduce its emissions to 26 to 28% below its 2005 levels by 2030. That's a very modest target. It puts its 2030 emissions still above its 1990 emissions. For comparison, you might like to look at the European target. The Europeans' pledge for 2030 is 40% below its 1990 emissions. So you can see how relaxed is the attitude of Australia towards reducing its emissions. At the Glasgow COP, Australia did at last accept a target of net zero emissions by 2050, but it's not adopted any visible policies towards achieving that target. So this inaction of Australia is very conspicuous and also really quite surprising, considering that Australia is very vulnerable to climate change. Australia has extremes of weather and always has, swinging between drought and floods, and climate change is making these extremes conspicuously worse. I've got a picture just to remind you. This is actually a picture that I stole from an article of Frank's, who no doubt stole it from somewhere else. This is a picture of one of the fires in the Black Summer. This particular one forced, I think it was about 1,000 people onto that beach in the foreground because they had no other escape from it. And after a week, they were picked up by the Navy. So it was like a wartime evacuation. The extent of the fires, to remind you, was 18.6 million hectares of Australia that burnt. And then, of course, now we have the opposite extremes. We have the devastating floods in Queensland and New South Wales. So these extremes are getting worse. And many people assume that when things get really bad, as frankly they are in Australia, our governments will start eventually doing something about them. But you may remember that Scott Morrison said during the height of the fires, he said he would not be pushed by environmentalists into making what he called reckless cuts to the coal industry. Coal mines are still being opened in Australia. So why is there this inaction? And why is there in particular this inaction in Australia? Well, it's because of the political power of the fossil fuel lobby in the coal industry in Australia. Coal is the country's second largest export, and it directly employs nearly 40,000 people, and this gives it enormous political clout. Well, I'm reminding you of these depressing facts for two reasons. The first is to make it clear that the international effort to bring climate change under control is failing. You might even say it's failed. This effort has been in train since the Rio summit in 1992, that's 30 years, and still emissions are continuing to grow. That attempt to bring climate change under control, managed by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, has basically rested on a moral appeal. There's a genuine moral appeal. Because of the greenhouse effect, our emissions of greenhouse gas are causing great harm to other people and will cause great harm in the future. So on moral grounds, we should therefore reduce emissions. That's a simple bit of common sense morality. For example, the Stern Review, which is what now 16, 17 years old, recommended that the present generation should make a sacrifice of a few percent of its income for the sake of bringing a much greater benefit to people in 150 or 200 years. Why should we do that? Why should we do what the Stern Review recommends, which is to reduce our own income for the sake of the future? Well, obviously, this is because it's a moral responsibility that we have towards future people. So the moral appeal was plain in the Stern Review. And now to give you a recent example, we have Greta Thunberg's remarkable speech to the United Nations General Assembly, in which she said, "How dare you," she said, "you are failing us, but the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you, and if you choose to fail us, I say, we will never forgive you." Now, I think she's right. Climate change is a great moral wrong perpetrated by some people on other people, and in particular by the old on the young. This moral appeal of Greta's is certainly justified, and it's of course made stronger by the fact that she is a living representative of the generations who are going to suffer as a result. A justified moral appeal, and a very strong one, but it's not proving effective enough to bring climate change under control. Many of us as individuals are moved by morality. We're willing to make sacrifices for the sake of future people. We spend money on insulating our houses, we eat less meat, we reduce our travel, and so on. But individual morality will never solve the problem of climate change. That's mainly because just not enough people will respond to the requirements of morality. But furthermore, in order to reduce our emissions substantially, we need big changes in our economic infrastructure. And as individuals, we're not in a position to make those changes. To solve the problem of climate change, it's governments that need to act. They can't leave this responsibility to individuals. Governments have the coercive power to make everyone change their behavior in the way that they need to, through regulation and through taxes. It's not going to be just, we won't rely on just the few people who are morally motivated. Governments can make everybody take action. But the problem is that many governments are impervious to morality. And that's the second lesson I draw from the dire stories that I was telling you at the beginning. Governments prevaricate. They tell lies, they cheat, they make promises that they don't intend to keep, and they really don't care about the further future. To some extent, no doubt, governments are responsive to the moral motivations of their people, but not to a great enough extent. Democratic governments are supposed to be, but even though most Australian people want their government to act much more strongly to control climate change, the government doesn't actually do it. It's influenced more by the coal lobby than by the electorate. And of course, the largest emitter of greenhouse gas is China, which is not a democracy at all. I've got a quote here from the great economist of the early 20th century, A.C. Pigou. The state should protect the interests of the future in some degree against the effects of our preference for ourselves over our descendants. It's the clear duty of government, which is the trustee for unborn generations as well as for its present citizens, to watch over and defend the exhaustible natural resources of the country from rash and reckless spoliation. Notice he uses the word reckless in quite the opposite direction to Scott Morrison. But the boot is actually on the other foot. It seems to be the governments that don't care about the unborn generation, even when their citizens do. Instead, they're very strongly motivated by the great influence of the fossil fuel interests. So long as there are powerful interests opposed to controlling climate change, governments will not act as they should to respond to it. Morality itself is never going to motivate governments. So the only way we can achieve any satisfactory response is to make sure it's not in anyone's interest to oppose action. And I think this is what we should aim for now. We should make it in everyone's interest to support action on climate change. We shouldn't ask anyone to make sacrifices for moral reasons. If we can do that, we can then harness the strong power of self-interest to drive action on climate change. And this can be done. It is possible to control climate change in a way that asks for no sacrifice from anybody. And that means not even from the fossil fuel interests, from the owners of fossil fuel resources and those who work in the coal mine. None of us need make a sacrifice in order to bring climate change under control. That's likely to come as a surprise to many of you, I imagine. This moral approach has been pressed for so long that we're all used to thinking that the current generation really has to make a sacrifice for the sake of the future. But that's not so. There's so much benefit to be gained by bringing climate change under control that there's enough to go around everyone if it's properly distributed. It only has to be distributed correctly across the generations and across the people within each generation. Suppose that we did make a sacrifice to clean up the air. That would, in the natural course of things, that would, the benefit from that would accrue to people in the future. But we have means of transferring that benefit back to us to compensate us fully for the sacrifice that we initially make and leave us as well off as before. In effect, the future generations can pay for the cleanup, which is done by the present generation, and still emerge better off. I'm telling you that. How do I know it? Well, I know it from economic theory. Greenhouse gas is what economists call an externality. When you do cause some emission of greenhouse gas, the gas spreads around the world. It does harm all over and for a very long stretch of time. And all of that harm is part of the cost of what you do, but you don't bear this cost. It's borne by all the other people. So you don't take the full cost of your activities into account in deciding how to act. And the consequence is a sort of inefficiency in the economy, and a very large inefficiency. According to standard economic theory, it's what's called a Pareto inefficiency. A situation is defined to be Pareto inefficient if it's possible in principle to change things in a way that makes somebody end up better off and nobody end up worse off. And according to standard economic theory, an externality causes Pareto inefficiency. So it puts us into a situation where things can be made better for somebody, but no worse for anybody else. But I'm sorry to say the standard economic theory of externalities doesn't apply to greenhouse gas, because that's an intergenerational externality and involves future generations as well as present people. And that makes the theory invalid. The theory requires a constant population with constant preferences. The reason it makes it invalid is what philosophers call the non-identity problem. Whatever we do about climate change is going to alter the makeup and probably the numbers of the world's future population. For example, if our governments take any serious action against climate change, they will alter the way that we live our lives. People will travel around less. People will live more locally. They will meet different people. They will have babies with different people. They'll probably have different numbers of babies. And the result will be that the next generation will be made up of different people from the ones it would have been made up of. And there may be more or fewer people in the next generation than there would have been. And the standard economic theory does not apply in those circumstances. It doesn't apply except to a fixed population with fixed preferences. To give you an idea of why not, think of a sort of extreme example. Suppose it happens that government policy to restrict climate change causes more people to be born with some sort of genetic problem. People to be born with less ability to enjoy a good life. For example, perhaps there's more inbreeding because people are not moving away from where they're born so far. Well, then the government policy is not going to be able to ensure that everybody in the future generation is better off than people in future generations would have been, because some of these people will be genetically unable to achieve that. So you can see that the basic theory is going to fail, but it can be repaired. And I think I'm simply going to tell you that it can be repaired and not go into detail about the repair. The theory that emerges is, does say that greenhouse gas leads to a sort of inefficiency, but the inefficiency is not a Pareto inefficiency. It's a weaker sort of inefficiency. I'll tell you briefly what it says. It says that we will end up in a situation where it's possible to make someone in the present generation better off, no one in the present living generation worse off, and for the resources that are passed through to future generations to be no worse than they would otherwise have been. So we're looking at from the perspective of resources going to future generations, rather than the well-being of the individual people who live in future generations. And greenhouse gas does lead to that sort of inefficiency that I just described. It leads to resource-constrained inefficiency. So it is possible to improve things for people in the present generation, making no one in the present generation worse off, whilst leaving equally good or better resources for future generations. So it's possible, and I think that our approach to climate change policy should be constrained by the condition that it requires no sacrifice. I think we should adopt the no sacrifice constraint on what our policy should be, and I can illustrate it for those of you with an economics background with a diagram here. On the axes I've got present consumption and future consumption. You could think of that as the resources available to future people rather than their consumption if you want. There's a straight downward sloping line there, which shows the possibilities, what's available. It's possible for us to take, for the present generation to consume this much, leaving nothing for the future, or for not to consume anything and leave it all for the future, or at any point on the straight line in between. Where we are now, because we have this sort of inefficiency, is we're below this frontier. I marked a point, business as usual. And what the diagram shows is that it is possible for us to move to a place up here, which is better for both generations. It's just a sketch of what we could do. I've also put in something which marks the conclusions of some of the cost-benefit analyses that economists have done on climate change. The Stern Review is one, there's another one by Nordhaus, William Nordhaus. And those economists who work on this generally conclude that the best thing we could do is to move to some position like this. This curve here is an indifference curve, if you like, between present and future generation. The highest one we can get to is there, where the present generation does make a sacrifice. So the point here, which we can get to, is not the best, but it doesn't demand a sacrifice on anyone's part. That cost-benefit analysis says that any of the points we get to will not be the best, and I think that that's probably the truth. And therefore, when I make this recommendation that we should adopt the no sacrifice constraint, I'm deliberately recommending a solution that is not the best that's available. And that means there are strong objections to the sort of solution I'm recommending, the sort of solution that involves no sacrifice. The two objections can be, there are really two rather different objections. The first is it'll leave the world with economic maldistribution. So adopting this constraint means that the world will end up with a distribution of income and wealth less good than it might have been. And secondly, and this is a different point, it'll perpetuate injustice in the world. And I've explained both those objections and respond to them. So maldistribution first. mean, it's natural to think that our policy on climate change should aim for the best possible results, and that involves achieving the best distribution of income and wealth. And I'm saying we shouldn't do that. The no sacrifice constraint will prevent us from achieving that. So we'll end up with some maldistribution in the world, maldistribution of two different sorts. One is intergenerational maldistribution. Economists, as I've said, have calculated what the best result would be, and most of them indicate that the best result is here, where the first generation is less well off and the later generation is better off. That would be the ideal distribution across generations. And my proposal is not to go for that ideal distribution. But that's where we started. For 30 years, we've been trying a moral appeal to get the present generation to make a sacrifice for the sake of the future, because that would be the best thing that could be done. And it hasn't worked. The moral appeal has failed. As represented by our governments, we, the present generation, are not willing to make the sacrifice that's required. And that's why I now recommend a different approach. We have to accept that what's politically possible is not going to lead to the best intergenerational distribution. What about distribution within a generation? The world is grossly unequal, and that's plainly a very bad thing. It would be better for the world to be more equal. And that means if we were to choose our climate policy with the aim of getting the best possible world, it would involve some redistribution from better off people to worse off people within the present generation. But imposing the no sacrifice constraint blocks that redistribution. The better off people are not going to be asked to make offer a subsidy to the less well off people. So the distribution is going to end up intragenerationally worse than it would have been without the no sacrifice constraint. And that's bad, but again, it can't be helped, since it's the better off people in the present generation who are not willing to accept a sacrifice. The world's beset by many problems. Climate change is one of them, and inequality is another. And we don't have to solve all the problems at the same time by the same means. And I think we should not saddle our climate change policy with the second aim of putting distribution right in the world. If it were climate change that was the cause of this inequality, it would be a different matter. It might well be right to tackle the two problems together, but it's not the cause of the inequality. Climate change is far too recent to be, I mean, it is now contributing to inequality, but to be a major cause of it, it would have had to be around for a long time, and it hasn't. The world's inequality results from centuries of unequal economic development and colonialism, which has put us in the position we are. Climate change can't really be blamed for this. So I think that we should have to recognize that in order to solve climate change, we cannot at the same time take on the responsibility of putting right distribution in the world. Let me say that there is so much benefit to be gained by dealing with climate change. There's plenty of surplus resources available, and it's obvious that we should use the surplus that we can gain by dealing with climate change to improve the position of the present poor. So although we shouldn't ask for a sacrifice from the rich, we shouldn't expect to give them much of the benefits. It should be the present poor who should expect most of the benefit. And that seems to me a sort of obvious conclusion to draw from the fact that there is so much available. So to summarize that, the problem of maldistribution is serious and bad, but it's forced on us by the failure of our appeal to morality. The second objection is injustice. Maldistribution is sometimes called social injustice, but I mean something different by justice from injustice from maldistribution. When you do somebody a harm, you do her an injustice unless there's some exculpating circumstance. For example, you might do it in self-defense, or you might do it with her consent, for example. But when we emit greenhouse gas, we harm other people, and there aren't any exculpating circumstances, so our emissions are an injustice. And if we adopt the no sacrifice response to climate change, we do nothing to overcome that injustice which we are already perpetrating. And that's the objection. And it's certainly a correct objection. Think about, as an analogy, think about a slave owner who inflicts injustice on her slaves. Now suppose she releases the slaves and is compensated for doing so by the government or somebody or other. Then the slaves are free, that's better for them. She's no worse off because she's been compensated for the loss to her of having the slaves. So there's been no sacrifice. That's a no sacrifice solution, but the injustice has not been overcome. The slave owner was initially in an unjust position in having the slaves, and that advantage that she has not been taken away from her. The compensation perpetuates the injustice is not overcome. As I understand it, that's exactly what happened in the British West Indies at the emancipation of the slaves there. And the no sacrifice constraint is like that. Those who emit greenhouse gas, all of us, are in an unjust position of advantage because of our emissions, and our emissions inflict harm on others. And under a no sacrifice policy, we're going to be paid to stay, to maintain that position of advantage that we have. And it's worse too, because among the among the people who cause harm by their emissions of greenhouse gas, well, there are most of us who do some harm, but there are also people who knowingly do harm on a very large scale and do everything they can to continue in this unjust position. I'm thinking of the leaders of the fossil fuel industry. Several of them are very bad people. They tell lies about climate change, and they pay others to tell lies about climate change. For instance, the Koch brothers, who own a vast fossil fuel empire, spent $168 million up until 2018 only, funding groups that engage in climate denial. Justice requires people like that to be punished. But actually, under a no sacrifice policy, they will be rewarded, they will not be punished. And I think that's actually the worst feature of a no sacrifice policy. It sticks in the gullet, but I think we have to swallow it. These people's wealth gives them immense power. They can influence politicians directly, and they can manipulate the media to their own benefits. They're quite capable of blocking policies aimed at controlling climate change. In effect, they hold us to ransom, and I'm sorry to say, we have to pay the ransom that they require. We will have to buy out the fossil fuel interests. Now, Frank, I can't really remember when I actually started. It was pretty much 15:15, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's more a question of the remaining.
I know. So we now have 10 minutes remaining till 2. I know you have to go. We can keep the room until 2:30. Okay.
Or 3 o'clock for discussion for those.
Yes. Okay. All right then. So I probably, well, I'll say something very brief about this. So I've told you that the economic theory tells us that a no sacrifice solution is possible, and I've recommended that that's what we should achieve. You might wonder, how is this to be achieved in practice? And to put it very briefly, it's to be achieved by public borrowing. You can think of as a piece of public borrowing, that's to say the issuing of a public bond which is sold to people who buy it, and that brings money to the government. A government bond is in effect a sort of guarantee, a sort of promise to tax people in the future in order to repay the bond. So, but the government, if it issues bonds, if it borrows from the public, is taking on a commitment to increase taxes to people in the future. So this is a way of taxing future people, and the revenue, which is raised by selling these bonds, can be used to invest, to do green investments in the present, to make life in the future sufficiently good that the future people are better off even having paid that tax. So the financial instrument which can achieve this is public borrowing. If we had a world government, it wouldn't need to do it that way. It could simply, by decree, change the sort of investment that we're doing in the present from conventional investments, like building power stations and roads and so on, to green investments that will clean up the atmosphere for people in the future. And a switch of investment will make things better for people in the future and no worse for people in the present. But we don't have a world government. Instead, we have to do this through the capitalist system, and that means we have to achieve it through borrowing. Now, it'll be a lot of borrowing, and most countries are not at present in a position to borrow on the scale that will be needed in order to do the necessary green investment. So I think we need a new international financial institution, we'll call it a World Climate Bank, which will be given enough stability by the participation of the rich and stable economies of the world to allow it to guarantee debts by governments and make it possible for all this large amount of borrowing to take place. And that, I think, is the practical way in which we can achieve a solution to climate change.
John, thank you very much. We will take 10 to 12 minutes for formal discussion in the round. I will moderate this and I will give priority for the onliners. And just while I'll get myself sorted there to see what's going on with online questions, can I just start off with a comment and a question? So first of all, the comment is, thank you for showing us this elegant sidestepping of the non-identity problem, which always struck me as, not being a philosopher, as a sort of somewhat inexplicable obstacle that sat in the way of dealing with these intergenerational issues. So great to hear that there's a way to get around that non-identity obstacle in moral philosophy. Secondly, to finish, this gives you the opportunity to just continue where you left off, basically, in terms of the practicality of taxing the future, right? When we set aside financial markets and future taxation, it boils down, doesn't it, to the balance between present-day consumption and future consumption, right? And I think what you're telling Greta and friends is to say, okay, we can fix it for you, but we're not going to curtail present-day consumption for our generation and your generation, right? We're just going to shift investment, and we're going to shift investment towards climate change mitigation and away from the education system and the health system and all of the other things that might benefit the currently young generation in the future. Is it something like that? Is that the bargaining proposal to create?
Can I say something about the non-identity effect first? I just want to tell a story about that. Frank is just in the course of bringing to a conclusion the 6th assessment report of the IPCC. He and I were on the 5th assessment report, and I was one of 2 philosophers. The other one was Lukáš Meyer from Graz, who was very interested in the non-identity effect. And there is a section in that report which talks about the non-identity effect. And at one of the meetings we had, this was in Addis Ababa, we had a meeting, people were coming up to me, all the other people, the non-philosophers, and there were only 2 philosophers, and taking me aside and saying, you've got to do something about this, all this stuff on the non-identity problem. You know, obviously there's something wrong with that. It's just, we can't have that in the report. And it's certainly true that only philosophers ever take any notice of the non-identity problem. But nevertheless, I think they're right to take notice of it, and it is actually a really important problem. And it does damage the conclusion of the economics, but it can be got around. Yes, I think what you said about what I say to Greta is true, except, remember I did say she's right, okay?
Oh,
This complaint of hers is utterly justified. And, if I could do something about it, I would, but I know that our governments are not going to. And so we have to tolerate some remaining injustice.
Yeah. David Stern, floor is yours.
Thank you for an interesting talk. I think maybe what countries have already committed to through the Paris Treaty is their non-sacrifice constrained optimum. So they sort of agree to do a bit, but not too much. So maybe what you're suggesting here is what countries are already doing.
Well, what they're committed to is explicit, a lot less than 2 degrees, and if possible, 1.5 degrees.
Well, no, in terms of the programs,
okay, what they've actually decided to do.
The nationally defined contributions, yeah.
Well, I suppose it could turn out that way. What we know is that the commitments, the promises so far are going to come in at 2.4 degrees. I don't know whether that's tolerable for future generations. I mean, I don't know whether we can't do better than that within the no sacrifice constraint. I suspect that we probably can. I don't think that even 2 degrees will involve a huge sacrifice from the present, and certainly I don't think it'll involve such a big sacrifice that it can't be compensated for by loans from the future. So I'm not sure about that. I think that the no sacrifice solution would be better than 2.4 degrees actually, okay, if we can bring it off.
Okay. Online audience, which is quite numerous actually, have you got other questions and comments that you would like to share at this point?
They may not be able to hear, Frank. You have to stand in front of this computer.
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions and comments at this point from online?
I see a question in the chat from Anna Monero.
Yeah, go right ahead, Anna.
Oh, hi, Frank. Thanks. And thanks, John, for that great talk. My question was around how would those funds then be distributed and whether they would be invested in adaptation or mitigation or carbon capture, and how would those hypothetical funds were first collected? How would the burden on collection be distributed among countries? And then once the funds are collected, how would they be distributed? Which countries would receive those funds to be invested in those presumably companies or technologies that would then do the adaptation or the mitigation or the carbon capture? So more question on the practical side of things.
Yes.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. Well, I'm a believer in economic methods. So I think that the first thing that's going to be needed is a carbon price. And the idea of having a carbon price, which can be achieved through carbon taxes, is that it then provides the price mechanism is a sort of epistemic instrument. It's an instrument for finding out what is the best thing to do about problems. So that the prices, if they are corrected through an internalization of the externality by imposing a carbon price, will tell us what are the right ways to go about it. If, for instance, under the new circumstances with the carbon price, turns out to be quite profitable to do extraction of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by machinery, well, then we'll do that. If, on the other hand, that turns out to be very expensive relative to other means, like increasing renewable energy on a very large scale, then we'll do increasing renewable energy. So the means of doing it is something which comes later. What we need is the overall structure, and then the means of achieving results will become apparent. And so I don't know what the right way of doing it at the moment is. But you did also talk about distribution among countries. And I presume that to do this properly, that there will be large financial flows to countries. For example, my government, the British government, encourages people to put up solar panels in Britain, whereas everybody knows it's always cloudy and it rains a great deal. It's not the obvious place to put up solar panels. It should be financing the construction of solar panels and solar farms in the Sahara Desert, which is not so far away, and electricity can be transmitted from there back to Europe. So the investments that are needed should not be governed by geographic location of the place, the geographic location of where they're raised. They should be used in the best possible way, and that will involve transfers from some countries to others. It'll generally be transfers from the richer countries to the poorer countries where there are more available resources.
Question, Peter Ward, please, and then we'll go to the room here.
Thanks, John. Two very quick questions. First, is there a written up version of your presentation today that we can study in detail? We had quite a few interruptions that might have been delayed. There is.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There was a bit of interruption at the beginning. Well, there are two versions, but neither of them are what you need. One of them is published in Swedish, and the other is published as a report by somebody called the Global Challenges Foundation in Stockholm, and that is in English. It was published, I think, yesterday, but it doesn't have that one. If you're interested in the more practical things, it has more about the details of organizing a global climate bank, a world climate bank. And that is available now. If you were to look up,
I really want your.
You want my text? Okay.
Analysis.
Well, I can send you my text. Could you write to me?
Beautiful. Certainly.
Anyway,
Thank you very much.
I can certainly send you the text of more or less what I said today.
Thanks very much.
If any of you want to write to me, then I'll just send you a copy.
I said I had two questions. The second one about figure 1. What you call the value contour in figure 1 is what the economists call an indifference curve, as you know.
Yes.
It represents someone's preferences. Whose preferences are they?
No, it doesn't represent anyone's preferences. It represents the actual value of things. So this is about which distributions between the generations are equally good. So it depends on having an account of what the value of distributions between generations is, and this is a contour of that theory of value.
Value is not a subjective thing, reflecting someone's preferences?
Well, there are no doubt subjective elements to it. So what's good for a person very often depends on what she likes. To a large extent depends on what she likes. It may depend all on what she likes, but it's an objective question whether that is true. So this is a topic for analysis within ethical theory.
Okay. We'll go very
I understand that.
Thank you, Peter. We'll go very quickly to a question on interest rates, interest payments on those loans. I'm sorry, I'm not sure who's asking the question, but you have the floor.
Yes, interest payments.
Oh, no, just give him.
Sorry.
Go right ahead.
Oh, the question. Good.
Thanks for that. Thanks, John. That's really fascinating. I love this idea. Just had a practical question, and maybe the answer is go and read the document you were just talking about. But if there's a World Climate Bank issuing bonds, they need to pay interest on it. My worry is that if the interest is coming from, say, national government contributions, that's no longer a no sacrifices solution. So how do they, how does this bank pay its interest on those bonds?
Yeah, thank you. It is in the document, and perhaps at this point I better acknowledge Duncan Foley, who was actually my PhD supervisor when I was a student in economics. The idea of the World Climate Bank is Duncan's idea, and this is the thing that we're now propagating through the Global Challenges Foundation. So it's in there. So I'll tell you, so this is Duncan's answer that's coming out. Remember that I think the best way of implementing this is to have a carbon price which can be achieved by a carbon tax. If you have a carbon tax, you have revenue from the carbon tax. And so we have available a pool of money which is ultimately to be distributed across people, and the aim of the distribution of it is to compensate them fully for paying the carbon tax. So the theoretical end point is that everybody pays the carbon tax, which means that they then take account of the true cost of emitting carbon, and they make correct decisions on that basis, but they're compensated for paying that by receiving some subsidy in some other way. For instance, income tax would be reduced. But at any rate, the point is that there is a pool of revenue coming from the carbon tax, and that is available to pay interest on the loan.
Yep, thanks.
Okay, so this is the point where we're moving into extra time, and anyone online or in person who needs to leave, very much understood. Thank you for coming. And I've got the first question in the room. I think, can we just go from right to left? Sorry, I don't know your name, Jack.
Oh, thanks, John. So it looks like there are two levels of solution. So one is the first level of solution, that is substantive solution to climate change. We need to build a great infrastructure and move away from the existing infrastructure. And the argument I take it is that that solution currently is politically unavailable to us because governments are not moved by our moral arguments, because it would require sacrifice, and because the governments are beholden to special interests like the fossil fuel industry. So you're proposing kind of a second level of solution. Let's put in these financial institutions that will allow us borrowing from the future, which would remove the sacrifice constraint. And that will enable us to actually implement that first level solution. So my question is, I'm not convinced that the obstacles to that first level solution in the first place are not also obstacles to the second level solution. Because again, okay, we have a proposal, let's create a World Climate Bank. Who are we going to? The governments. Again, by your argument, by your assumption, governments are not interested in addressing climate change. They're not moved by future people. They're not moved by moral arguments. They are still beholden to the fossil fuel interest. We are promising compensation, so maybe the lack of sacrifice makes it a bit more tractable, but I think the structure of the problem is still the same. The agents are so constrained in this environment that no one is actually willing to do anything. So can you please explain how?
I think the way you structured the question wasn't quite right. So you said there are two levels, and I think that's quite right. There's first of all the level of the real economy, the flows of goods, and then there's the financial economy, which in a capitalist system can be used to implement the flows of goods. The stuff about the no sacrifice solution, that's something that's happening. I presented that at the level of the real economy. The real economy, the investment, the consumption, production, and so on, in the economy can be organized in such a way that there need be no sacrifice compared with the business as usual and not doing anything about climate change. No sacrifice for anybody. And that's a matter of reality. We don't have to think about finance at all for that. And that's what the economic theory does. The economic theory is a matter of real goods. And it's a true theory. So it does tell us that there is a solution that involves no sacrifice as defined. It's not it may be a Pareto, it's not a Pareto inefficiency, but there is a sort of inefficiency, and that's true. But then we get to the practical question of, if there is this solution, how do we get to it? And if we had a planned economy, a world economy, then we would do it by planning, but we don't. We've got a basically capitalist world economy, so we've got to use the instruments that capitalism makes available to us, and these are the financial markets and that sort of thing, and pricing mechanisms. You've got to do it by taxes, putting a price on carbon, and borrowing money. But you said, well, wouldn't the fossil fuel interests obstruct that? Well, Yeah, they would if they were stupid, and it's quite possible that they will. You know, people don't always do what's in their own interests. But if we make it in the interests of the fossil fuel people to pull out of fossil fuels, sell up their holdings to the government for a correctly valued price, then they haven't any reason to do that. Except, and perhaps this is a qualification worth mentioning, when I say the theory tells us that nobody need make a sacrifice, that does include the owners of fossil fuel, but they won't have to make a sacrifice relative to the true value of their holdings. And the true value of their holdings is the integrated value of the revenue that they can gain from their holdings through the future. But as I understand it at the moment, fossil fuel reserves are not on the market priced at that level. There is a bubble going on, and the market in fossil fuel shares appears to be founded on the premise that all the reserves that the fossil fuel companies own will eventually get burnt. But we know they can't get burnt because we know there's 5 times as much fossil fuel in known reserves than can be burnt without destroying the economy that gives them value in the first place. So the present value on the market of fossil fuels and fossil fuel shares is too high. And the theory doesn't say we can buy people out at that price. They've made a wrong investment because that price has got to collapse somehow, since they cannot achieve that revenue in the future. So it can buy them out at the proper price. So the theory is only going to work when the prices collapse, but they will collapse. I mean, as climate change continues, they will collapse. There will be the bubble will burst. I'm very keen on the disinvestment movement, the divestment movement, which is getting more and more institutions from divest from fossil fuels. The price will come back to the level it should be, and then they can be bought out at the market price.
I would quite like to have a few other questions and then move into informal conversation. Seeing with so much of time, it's okay, John.
John, very interesting. I've got a comment, a sort of checking comment, and then a quick question. The checking comment is to follow up what you were saying about the whole debt and borrowing solution with the World Climate Bank being about avoiding a sacrifice of consumption by the present generation. As far as I can see, tell me if I'm wrong, what you've worked out is a solution whereby you have a voluntary reduction in consumption by the present generation, and that, well,
yeah, okay,
this is why I'm thinking about it, because I keep on, every time I hear about debt, which I'll probably read in Economics 101 properly, I'm interested in the people who are lending. And as far as I can work out, the people who are lending, that is bond buyers, they are paying money to buy these bonds, which means they're reducing their consumption voluntarily because they get back then their interest payments in the future. So they're voluntarily reducing their consumption by buying the bonds, and then you've solved the problem of it's reduction in consumption by the current generation, but not a sacrifice in the sense it's a voluntary one. It's induced by the future interest payments. Is that correct?
No, they're not reducing their consumption, they're reducing their conventional investment. I mean, this is the idea. How do we, if we don't issue bonds, there will be some pattern of consumption through the future. Okay. And the idea of issuing bonds is to move some consumption from the future back to the present, right? Mm-hmm. How do we do that? By borrowing from investors, not from consumers. So you borrow from people, right, who would have invested it in conventional investment, okay, but they don't. Instead, they give it to the government that spends it on green investment. So there's less conventional investment, more green investment. Consumption in the present generation can remain the same. Okay. Then we get to the future, right? Now there's been green investment and less, but they're better off because, okay, so they're now better off, but they then have to be taxed in order to pay back to the capitalists. So they're taxing them in the future, reduces future consumption, and it goes back to the capitalists who aren't going to consume it. So this whole thing depends on capitalists who like to invest rather than to consume.
Yeah, and obviously also on the carbon price to make the investing in the World Climate Bank more attractive than the?
Yeah, it has to be profitable to buy these bonds.
So the question comes from comment at the end of your standard version of this paper, where you say that the World Climate Bank policy would be beneficial to each country individually, but it would be beneficial to each country individually not to participate in the World Climate Bank.
Yeah.
And my question is why? I'd be interested to know if you can spell out the costs and benefits. I couldn't quite work it out. But also, if that means that free riding is beneficial, but you think it can be overcome, why can't it be overcome with the conventional sort of global climate tax policy?
But the point about overcoming free riding is to deal with the prisoner's dilemma. I mean, what we know in a state of a prisoner's dilemma is that the outcome which every individual, which is arrived at by each individual country acting in its own interest, is inefficient for everybody, right? So what this does is make it possible for it to be good for every country to participate, but that doesn't prevent the temptation to be a free rider.
And my question was just asked in the answer. So it's exactly the same question. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so I'm very sympathetic to pushing this self-interest line as a path forward. But I'm wondering whether you've explored sort of more moderate versions of the principle. So your principle is no sacrifice. Involves this, for philosophers, the economic part is the elaborate part of the World Bank and the issuing of bonds and so on. But I guess a more moderate principle would be something like, you know, exploit self-interest where you can and remove the most obvious self-interest roadblocks. And it may come at a sacrifice for others. You know, some people are willing to sacrifice. Yeah. Others are roadblocks. So I'm very sympathetic and sort of something I'd like to explore a bit further, the idea of buying out fossil fuels. And I think there's interesting questions about what's the best thing to buy out. Yeah. You know, the mine or the power station, or, you know. Yeah, but it might be, we don't have to go for this all out, no sacrifice.
Yeah.
We
yes,
just need to remove the roadblocks.
Yes. Basically. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what I concentrated on was the bad people, the owners of the fossil fuel industries, and I said we need to buy them out. But there's another blockage which needs to be broken somehow or other. Many countries are tremendously resistant to having a carbon tax. You know, from the point of view of economics, nothing could be more obvious than that we need to have a carbon tax set at whatever the external harm done by carbon is. And it would be much the easiest to implement that by using the revenue from the carbon tax to reduce other people's taxes or to recycle it into the benefit of people. So, but even so, for somehow or other, it's very hard politically for many countries to implement a carbon tax. Why is that? Well, people hate taxes. Why do they hate taxes? Well, obviously, you know, it's against your interest to pay taxes. So it's against, as things stand, it at least appears to be against the interests of all sorts of people to adopt the obvious policy of having a carbon tax. So how do we overcome that? Well, we make sure that people do not suffer by paying a carbon tax. So we make sure that everybody is fully compensated for paying the carbon tax. And a number of countries have done something approximately like that. They take the revenue from the carbon tax and they recycle it among their own population. They reduce income taxes, or in other words. So British Columbia has a carbon tax that was explicitly meant to be revenue neutral. So any revenue that came in from the carbon tax has to be put back into the community in some way or other. Now, the revenue you raise from the carbon tax is never, this is a bit of theory, is never going to be enough to compensate everybody fully for paying the carbon tax. So we need some more money, and that money is going to have to come from borrowing borrowing. That's why everybody can be compensated. But everybody can be compensated for paying a carbon tax. And surely, if we can set it up so that nobody loses by paying the carbon tax, then we can implement a carbon tax, which is a really essential thing in order to deal with climate change effectively. So it's not just, you know, to the particular powerful interests, the lobby groups, that I'm concerned about. It's this other thing, that this obvious step is not being taken.
John, what do you reckon? Is this a good point to morph it into a more private conversation and close the formal proceeding? So with that, thank you very much again for...
well, thank you for inviting me, Frank.
Okay.